In this episode, I'm going to cover 5 common myths with white balance that I guarantee you're probably still being affected by at least one of them. These are common myths that are propagated throughout photography genres, not just in real estate photography, but elsewhere. And let's start with the first one, and that is that white balance truly does affect exposure, or brightness to be more exact. We can see why if we take a look at this color wheel. Once we remove all the colors and turn this into a grayscale, we can see that each one of these colors has a different brightness. We can see that yellow is the brightest, blue is the darkest, and that's why warning signs in school buses are yellow, they aren't blue. We can also see though that this affects all kinds of other warmer temperatures, what we know as the advancing colors, more than the receding, cooler colors. So we can see how this works when we adjust the white balance. If we introduce more yellows, more of the advancing colors, we can see the histograms start to move to the right, starting to dominate more of the brightness. And you can see it looks like a brighter image, obviously not the color that we'd like. You can see also the same thing happen if we went into the blues and cooled it, but that's getting into the darker color. So it's actually not a brighter image. It's when we get into the advancing colors that we start seeing that. And we can see that more besides just white balance if we take a look at the color balance. So by taking this image into Photoshop and using a color balance adjustment layer, if we move the advancing colors into the red here on the top, going into the red instead of the blues, we can see up here on the histogram using just brightness, we can see that it starts getting brighter. We're moving into this brighter area. If we move it in the other direction, we then see the histogram start shifting to the other direction when we get into the cyans, because the blues are darker by nature. So here we are blue, it's darker. When we get all the way to the red, it is a brighter image. So the advancing colors, the warm tones, will start shifting things into a brighter area of the histogram, thus increasing the exposure, which you can take advantage of. And that leads up to the next myth, and that's that you should not always have correct white balance. Now, shooting real estate photography, when we're on the inside, we're after some type of neutral color. We want to get rid of as much color cast as we want. And on the outside, during the day, we want to have a true representation of greens and whatnot that we're used to seeing. But when it comes to twilight photography, you would be doing yourself a disservice if you use the correct white balance. The reason being is that when we're doing twilight photography, it's those warm tones, those yellows, those oranges, they will be brighter in the image just by the nature of what they are. If you start toning those down to a different white balance, then you're going to have a duller looking image. So that's why we want to maintain outside a good white balance of about 5,000 Kelvin. That'll get you those really rich colors. Also, another thing to look for here is that magenta actually is bright also. So we want to be able to have the magenta skies, the reflection of the magentas, plus those oranges and yellows in twilight shots to really dominate the scene where they are appropriate so that you get those real pops of extra brightness. In fact, let's take a couple quick measurements here of what the brightness is. Using the color picker in Photoshop, I can see what the brightness would be for any color down here next to the B. If I sample the yellow color, you can see it's very high at 97. If I sample the blue, it's very low at only 27. If I sample the red, it's 51, but when I go to magenta, magenta is actually brighter at 57. And that's why it's so important that with our twilight shots, we emphasize not just the warm tones of yellow and some of the oranges, but also the magentas. And these are things, by the way, that I cover in my course on professional exterior photography. As you may know, I've got a series of online courses to teach you real estate photography, including professional interior photography, expert editing for interiors, that professional exterior course, and I also have a fairly new course here on doing videography for real estate. And along with that, then, I also have some best-selling books that I've written on real estate photography, and one that's especially useful here, little off subject from real estate, and it covers all genres. It's Mastering Color in Photography. And that book especially really delves into the nitty-gritty of color, so if you're interested in learning something just beyond the courses, that would be good reading material for a weekend sometime also. I've links, by the way, to all my courses, all my books down in the description for this video, but let's move on to myth number 3. And that's that white balance is not a number. Now, we're used to working with setting a white balance, a Kelvin value on our cameras. Maybe 5,000 Kelvin, 5,500 Kelvin, 3,000 Kelvin, something along those lines. And then in post-processing, we'd be adjusting some sliders that also have those numbers along with a tint slider. But those aren't the mechanisms that are actually used when a raw file is decoded. Instead, inside of a raw file, you can find a reference number, but it's not applied whatsoever. It'll actually relate to an offset, a multiplier that's then used across the various color channels of red, green, and blue to get the proper color balance. This is why if you use different applications for photo editing, you'll see that you have a different temperature and tint value on the various sliders. And we can see this in particular for this particular finished image. If we take a look at the flash shot that was taken here in NX Studio, which is Nikon's OEM software, we can see a pretty accurate white balance. I was using 5,000 Kelvin here when I was flashing, and there's really no tint. Now, even though it was set to 5,000, well, it still isn't quite accurate even in NX Studio software because of those offsets. But now let's take a look at it over in Adobe software. And this was opened just with Camera Raw. And we can see here that it's 4,800. It's about 200 off instead of just 2 from 5,000 Kelvin, and the tint value is 13. If I were to take that tint value down to 0, the image would start looking green. That's because the numbers don't mean anything. It's the math that's applied from those offsets, from those multipliers, that will then determine the proper color balance. So when it comes to the white balance, don't try to think that in my camera, this is what I had, and Adobe is going to be able to read that 100 correct. It won't. If you really want to see what the white balance was that you used in your camera, you would want to use your camera's OEM software. In this case, this was Nikon, so it was NX Studio, or you'd want to be able to look in the raw file, which will have, besides just the multipliers, it will have the Kelvin value for reference. Now, myth number 4 is something that's often overlooked, and that's that white balance is the core of a lot of color issues, but it is not the only one. In fact, one of the very common issues with using any of the Adobe products is they want to apply a color profile. And I'm not talking about sRGB or Adobe 1998. What I'm talking about is their treatment profile. So by default, that's set to Adobe Color. But as I show throughout my courses and books, you want to be able to set that to whatever was matching in your camera. So something camera matching that would have the values that you expected to see when you were working with your photos on the back screen of your camera. No matter the case though, a different color profile being applied, a different treatment profile applied to your images will make them look different. So that's a really important thing. First off, besides just what program is decoding the software, but the other thing too is that even after adjusting white balance, you could see color casts. Now, color casts typically, and actually technically, are a white balance issue because white balance is a cast of color. But what we can see sometimes in real estate photography, especially in other genres, is that color could be reflecting, thereby casting that color onto other things. So here we take a look at the ceiling. It's got some red on it that's coming off of the hardwood floor from when it's being flashed. If I were to try to adjust the white balance for that image, it would be completely off. So what I want to do is first get my white balance to where it should be, ignoring those other color casts. And then, once my white balance is correct, then adjust the color cast. What happens all too often is a lot of photographers, while they're editing, just start playing with the sliders. That's all completely wrong. Don't look at the whole image, look at where the white balance should be for it, and then correct your color casts next. And myth number 5 is that white balance can be applied to any image you're editing in any format. Yes, we want to edit in RAW. We'll have the most flexibility doing that. It is completely non-destructive because no pixels have been processed yet when we're working with white balance and other adjustments. But there's nothing that says you can't adjust the white balance of a JPEG. You just won't be able to take it as far, but it's also similar to when doing video. When doing video, you can shoot in some RAW formats and whatnot, but most of the time it's going to be an MOV file coming out of your camera. And when you adjust the white balance on that, it's affected just fine. It's not going to be completely deteriorated as long as you don't have to adjust the white balance very far. And that's key to it. If you're really getting close on setting your white balance in the field anyways, no matter if you're doing photos and video, then you probably don't have very far to adjust it when it comes to adjusting the white balance later in post. So don't be afraid if you need to apply that to TIFFs, JPEGs, MOV files if you're doing video, but if you can, always use RAW files. There's one last topic I'd like to cover when it comes to white balance, and that is the myth that this eyedropper will help you. And sometimes it might, but for the most part, it won't. So if we take a look at this particular image, we can see why. Now there is a huge mix of all kinds of color temperature going on because we have light coming in from the outside. We have this incandescent lamp over here. We've got a different color temperature coming in here. So a lot of different stuff is going on. Now, when we take a flash shot of this to do the flambient workflow, then of course that goes away because of the exposure adjustments. I've got a flash that's over here, I'm flashing near the camera, so this is turning out really well. But if I tried to adjust the white balance here, then I'd get some strange results using the eyedropper. Now at first glance, this may look good, but it's actually off. And we can see over here that there's a bit of a different color on these windows because of that incandescent lamp. We can see that the walls look very blue here because of how I was toning this down. And you might have been using auto white balance, which then tried to get some type of a neutral point here, but could have failed also. In fact, here, if I were to just say to do an auto white balance, then I get this strange looking result. So we'll back out of there. So what we want to do, if we were to try to use this dropper, you would be using typically something you think is white. And if you clicked on like the crown molding, well, you're once again getting those strange results. I'll back out of there. If you think the ceiling is white, well, you're probably not correct. A lot of times ceilings aren't white. If I click on there, I get a slightly different result. And even if you used a gray card, the problem that you're having will still be the same in that what you're seeing is a lot of different color being cast on other objects across the room. So narrowing down on one area of an image to adjust your white balance is not the correct way to do it. Now, over time and with practice, it becomes very evident what this should be. But until you get to that point, there are ways to tackle this. Let's take a look at this over in Photoshop. So over here, I've got that flambient blended image. You've probably seen me do this before on other tutorials. And of course, if you have my books or my courses, you've seen this as well, where I've got this flash shot down here. I've got a certain amount of ambient luminance that's been placed on the top of it, not the color, just the luminance, and then a darken mode window pull, which helps get rid of some of this out here where it was just a little blown out, so we just added that in. Completely optional, a little off topic, but what we'd want to do here to adjust this is to find a neutral area. Now this is just practice. I show many different ways, like in the expert editing course, on how to tackle this, how to neutralize, how to really find where your white balance is. But the more you can see this right up front, the better things will be. And so to practice this, what you can simply do is work, for instance, with your flash layer, or if you're using HDR, use one of those layers. And what I'll do for right now is I'll just shut this off, and I'm going to take this layer and I'm going to duplicate it. I'll do a Control-J just to duplicate it, and I want to neutralize it to one color, and to do that you would go to Filter, Blur, and Average. Now what that did was blur everything into one common color And that then is what we can gauge to where our color balance is. Next, what I would do is to take the color picker tool. You can use the swatch here or the color picker tool. But if you select that and then you select a color anywhere inside here, it doesn't matter. And when you take a look at the color, you can then see what's going on. If the RGB right here is not completely equal, then you have a color imbalance. An average color inside, when we're working with interior photography, it should be fairly neutral, but not always. And this goes back to, once again, where we talked about you don't have to have always the correct white balance. But this gives us a judgment of what we're really seeing. Because a lot of times we look at images long enough, we don't see that what's happening. And in this case, we have more reds and a lot more blues than what we have greens. That's why R is 147, which is higher than the greens of 144, but blues are even way higher at 151. This tells me that I need to reduce the reds just a little bit, and I need to reduce the blues a lot more. So let's shut this off, just say okay, and I'll get rid of this reference layer. So what I'll do is I'll take this shot here and I'll duplicate it, do Control J. And once again, this is just an exercise. You can do this in your workflow if you want, but like I show in my courses and books, there are faster ways. But to get an idea what's going on here now, let's go and use the Camera Raw filter, which has white balance. So we'll go up here to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, opening that up. Now you remember that the reds were just a little on the high side. So what I'd do is I would take the temp slider, which instead of moving it into the red or magenta zone, I would move it into the greens just a little bit, like about that much. Let's say about -3, -4. Also, the blues were very high, so what that means is I should probably warm this up into the yellow tone on my temperature by more than the green, so we'll move this up to, let's say, about 3 or 4. So that's probably good. I might even be able to go just a little bit higher to maybe about 5 and see how that looks. Now I can click OK, but I can also, within, for instance, Camera Raw, see immediately the difference by going down here and clicking on the before and after views. You can see the difference already, but we can also get close by just zooming in here. And then if I hold the space bar down, I can move this around and see the difference. Now you're not being deceived by seeing the whole picture. You can see now side to side that over here, this looks white compared to this, which actually looks blue. And if you're looking very close, it might not be capturing very well on the screen capture, there is a tint of red. So we can see that, you can zoom in, you can zoom out, and then move this around and see how well that looks. If you still feel that it's a little bit off, then of course you can make these adjustments here. But I'll just get rid of that view, and then I'll just click OK. Now we can see that change. Now, something else to notice, and you can see it happen on the histogram here, it goes back to the first myth that I talked about, when white balance changes the exposure. So if we turn this on and off, we can see it looks darker without those adjustments, and now it looks brighter with those adjustments. And that's because I increased the warmth a little bit. Now when I turn my other layers back on, we have a more natural looking image. And once again, exposure is affecting our color, not just from the changes that we made on this layer, which went from here, which was very bluish, to now a little bit warm, we can see it, but also because the color will change because we're adding some other luminance, some other light in there, doing the flambient blending. But the key here is twofold. One, yes, by using flash, we got a very consistent color. But then we can adjust our white balance by seeing where it should be. Trying to use automated methods with those eyedroppers rarely work very well, especially since we've got all these various colors that are being mixed from various light sources. So the more familiar you are with gauging your color and gauging your white balance, the better off you'll be when it comes to then making those adjustments in post-processing. White balance is one of those things that's just so often taken for granted, but once you get it down, once you understand what's really going on behind the scenes, then you can start making better images than what you already are.